And welcome into Priced Out, the podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Morgan, alongside your other host, Cornelius Swart. How you doing today, boss?
I'm doing good, sir. How are you?
All right, man. We got a really great show today. I've been looking forward to this series kicking off.
Yeah, this is a series, an occasional series we're going to do about things that were left out or cut out of the first two films. So issues like wage inequality. A lot of people say, why aren't you talking about capitalism in Priced Out? There's no indictment of capitalism. So that's a big area that we didn't feel we could get into, and so it's not in the film. So we'll talk about that during this series. Another big one is the drug war, mass incarceration, understanding that crime in the neighborhood was not simply people like waking up in the morning and saying, hey, let's do some crimes.
Yeah.
Like, we love crime here in the black community.
To us. Yeah. No, that was not the case.
Yeah. But that's a sort of a subject that was kind of, we felt like it was too big to kind of tackle fairly. So this next interview is with Rahsaan Muhamaad, who grew up in the neighborhood. He was living up the street or working up the street. He was running with gangs, basically. And he has a real perspective on both the drug war and Nikki's fight with what she called drug houses in the neighborhood that is not included in the film. You know, in Northeast Passage, the first film, Nikki is constantly fighting to clean up her street, to get rid of the drug houses on her street. And Rahsaan knew of Nikki. He knew those houses. He was operating on the streets at that time. And so I didn't have the courage to go walk across the street and talk to the people who were being accused of being drug dealers or drug users.
Right.
And that's on me as a bad journalist, but also as a very young one. I would preface it.
Yeah.
So this is an opportunity for us to get his point of view.
And it is his point of view. And I think that's one of the things we definitely have to always mention, that you may not necessarily agree with everything that's being said, but that's the beautiful thing about this podcast, is that it's his truth, and we get a chance to share in his truth. So I'm excited about it.
Yeah, and we invite anybody else who wants to talk about this to come and talk with us about these issues, because this is like new media in that we don't tell the whole story from all the points of view all at once. Mm-hmm. It's more like, here's a spotlight on this point of view, and we really don't challenge him on anything. He'll say things like, there were no economic opportunities in the area, so crime was kind of like a way to just make a living, and not everybody feels that way. But it really is his point of view. It's how he grew up, and so if you don't agree, we'd love to have you reach out and talk to us, and have you on the next show.
All right, so let's get it going. Here's Rahsaan.
You're an artisanal glassmaker, you're a community organizer and an activist, but you also grew up on the streets and in the life. And so if we could ask, what was it like? Did you have a sense of, like, sometimes we've talked to people who really didn't know that black folks were a minority in Portland because they just never left the neighborhood,
right?
And or never had been treated with hostility before they left the neighborhood, because just living in the neighborhood, you were just part of a community.
That's true. Now, with that said, part of our upbringing was that fight. Mm-hmm. Like we all of us were conscious, the children and the parents, that we are in a fight against racism. We're in a fight against social inequality and economic inequality.
You've seen Northeast Passage and you've seen Priced Out. And
yes.
So you agreed to do this interview. What was your interest in talking with us?
I really feel like there's a story and a perspective that is not told. And that's really the perspective of the young black man or black male. And I really feel and felt at the time that I took a look at those documentaries that, I think with the climate of what is taking place in a lot of the inner cities with the conflicts between neighborhoods and the policing of those neighborhoods and the outright murders, really, of young black men and women in these neighborhoods, that another side needed to be told.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the perspective of those who had been criminalized,
Mm-hmm.
who media and movie making and newspapers and radio programs were actually describing to people or to listeners, but that wasn't who we were.
Mm-hmm.
And I really felt a strong urge to tell that story now.
Who were the black inspirations for you, the black male inspirations and leaders when you were growing up?
You know, I grew up in the church. We used to love the examples of the messengers and the prophets that were in the Bible, the Torah, the Gospels. Portland doesn't have a social history of being a big religious town, but I don't want that to be misconstrued. The reason why we haven't been a great religious is like our heroes were close to us. You know, they were our mothers, our fathers, our uncles. But as far as a principal individual that I could say I relate to that,
Mm-hmm.
I would want to be like that.
Mm-hmm.
I would want to use this individual as an example. For me, it was Minister Farrakhan. It was the Stop the Killing tours that were taking place in the early 90s. I mean, that was the only real live human being that I saw in that era that even was close to being someone to look up to. With that said, just to backtrack a little bit, they were always amazing brothers in these street organizations, so-called gangs and whatnot, athletes and whatnot, that we looked up to. Like, we looked up to our peers, our homies, our people around us. You know, Minister Farrakhan was a distant icon to be able to look up to, that we saw as the inheritor of the civil rights movement, the inheritor of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Elijah Muhammad, the father of them all. Like, we saw him as the last embodiment of all of that. But our set, you know, our boys that we grew up with, man, I knew some men that, you know, I could tell stories that people wouldn't believe that actually happened.
So when you say set, break that down. What are you talking about?
A set is a particular area, street, block, house that you claim. It's land, it's territory. We call that the set.
So how did you get involved in quote unquote gang life?
I had a cousin who was, from the time I can remember, you know, walking and running and talking, I had an older cousin who was my big influence in my life, you know. And, you know, we didn't see gang or gang life, quote unquote, the way we discuss it now. We saw it as the people that you get along with the best, the people who you are like-minded with. And quite honestly, that became as simple as the people who like the same colors that you like, and shoes and clothes.
Was there an incident though where you became like officially like?
Yeah, there was many instances. You know, because if you want to be something and somebody in it, you know, there wasn't any one particular instance. But the one thing that I guess I would say along those lines, would be comfortable with saying, is that at a certain point on Albina and Shaver, going through all of these changes and whatnot that were taking place, we felt the need to start something new. And so, you know, we began to start setting up the set, you know, ABC, Albina Block Crip. But the problem was, you know, we had Bloods, we had a lot of different sets that were interacting in business. And so we wanted to develop something that could utilize all that. And so we started to beat folk in. Traditionally, in a set or a gang or whatnot, there's an initiation. It always starts with, you got to take on the whole set. You got to fight the whole set. and I think it's overly glorified.
It's a fist fight.
It used to be fist fights. Now today it's just gun somebody down. You know, at least that's what I can't say what the BGs is on, but you know, it's glorified that you got to kill somebody before you become a gang member. I think that really kind of oversells the carnage. But yeah, I mean, that takes place. Don't get it twisted. What I'm saying is that in order to be the baddest cat, you know, you got to take out the baddest cats. But the progression of the gang life, so to speak, is really as ancient as tribes and all of their rites of passage. At that time, that just seemed like the rite of passage for the male to engage in a masculine activity, to be a male that would not be that could provide and that could not, you know, wouldn't be nicked off or picked off. It's ancient, it's natural to have a rite of passage, and that's how we saw that in that time. You know, an older male would take a younger male and give him the law of the land. And so that just happened to be labeled today in something that we call gangs, but this was the community, this was the neighborhood. You
know? So let's get into that part then. What was it like before the California style gang came into the neighborhood? What was that? I mean, you were just talking about, you know, young men. It was like you guys you were hanging out with. You know, this is before drugs as a big business was moving in. What was that like? And then what was your first memories of that new culture moving in?
Man, that's an excellent question. We couldn't get our hands on anything like a real weapon, a gun. You know, a lot of us had knives. Every now and then, somebody would come across a little .22 revolver, and, you know, that was big time stuff. But the difference was, you know, we use the term today, gang. But the truth is that this was the neighborhood. This is where we lived. And so, like any natural territory that you occupied, anything that was not from that territory or that was outside, we naturally had a curiosity for. But the idea of community, you know, is really encapsulated in this term gang. You know, gang has been a term that's been criminalized with criminal behavior, but this was a natural occurrence of the neighborhood.
It's like friends as an extension of family, people looking out for each other. I mean, that happens everywhere.
Happens everywhere, just like conflict. Conflict is natural. I mean, you run into disagreements, but it's how you settle those conflicts that determine, you know, the life and the vibrancy of a neighborhood. So before the California style, which was really the influx of weapons, the influx of these tools now that you could engage in killing with impunity. And so the difference was, you know, all of our differences were settled with fights. Right. It was settled with physical competition. It was Roman style. It was wrestling. It also was something that the educators, the teachers, the principals, the community, and the parents all worked together to foster the conflict resolution. Conflict resolution took place in sports. Conflict resolution took place, you know, on the football field, on the basketball courts, and the wrestling, on the chessboard.
Or Big Mama, you know, there's sometimes there'd be someone on the block who kind of was the judge of conflict, would hear both sides, whether it was Big Mama or somebody else or somebody who's respected, or a minister or pastor.
Yeah. You know, well, Big Mama was a pretty rare individual. She's common today in media.
Is it like folklore?
But Big Mama was the baddest sister who didn't take no mess from nobody. And they weren't common. Like, there was a Big Mama, you know, I wouldn't even say you'd have one for every neighborhood, because this is another part of the story that I feel is not told, is the neighborhoods were upheld by married couples who, and not of the physical imagery of what Big Mama was about, but these were the alpha males and the alpha females that, you know, they're mystified in comic stories and things like that, but these were real people. And these were the people that we looked up to. These were the men and women that we actually looked up to. who were taking care of their business, but who were strong, who were artistic, who could sing, who could dance, who could rap. They see, these individuals seem to have a package of expression with them, and you naturally gravitate towards that type of leadership.
And they were holding it down
down completely, and did not want to be known.
Right.
Did not want to be out in the forefront, and that contributes to why that story is not told.
So back in the day, there's small beefs, or they seem big because you're a kid, but they're basically settled fisticuffs, or through expression. Kids used to settle beefs by break dancing. They break dance it off, man. Back in when I was a kid.
That's right.
So it was all. I mean, and that's classic. I mean, you can look at how people lived in the cities in the 50s, 40s, Irish neighborhoods in the 1800s. That shit is all, I'm sorry to say that, but that shit is all the same, right? It's like the skin colors change, but the behavior is all the same. And that cities all across this country. So there's really no difference there. But then something did change. I mean, what was changing was money was kept getting pulled out of the neighborhood, right? So you have like abandoned buildings. It's a bad environment, meaning it's, that's trouble to have a bunch of abandoned buildings. And we've already covered that in the film of like how a community gets extracted. It's in that context that something happens. They first started releasing parolees from California in Portland. Right. Can you tell us about, what happened there? What were the events there?
At the time, we didn't know that. Mm-hmm. This is after researching and wanting myself, feeling like I escaped, and I'm here today, wanting to look back to take a look at what was taking place. And the thing about that is that their stories and where they came from and why they're here, that was the myth. That's the part that no one could figure out. Leading up to that, there was a movie, Colors, that came out, and that narrative, it really showed what it would look like if an individual chose to work all sides. Shortly after it seemed that movie, maybe 2 or 3 years after that movie, we started coming in contact, Portlanders started coming in contact with what we would call outsiders.
Mm-hmm. And you saw, maybe for the first time, at least you with Colors, like what a California gang and California gang culture looked like.
Yeah.
Like what it looked like when things were completely lit.
Yeah, and the thing that was different that came on the big screen was, what would this be like if we had guns?
Mm-hmm.
See, that was the big thing that really flipped this thing upside down. Like in that movie, we saw if we had this type of weaponry,
mm-hmm.
We could do more opportunities opened up to us.
Mm-hmm.
So that really got a lot of the guys who really couldn't hold their own, which was a pretty strong majority of the neighborhood. What I mean hold your own, when we settle in disputes physically or with wit or with expression, everybody doesn't have all those talents.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe even the stronger majority doesn't have those talents developed. And so the scared guys saw that type of imagery and that equalizer as something to really obtain. And so that became a real desirable thing to have. It started off with one outsider, we'll call him Jack, but he was the first loner outsider who was from a California gang, and he started to make a little noise in the neighborhood, meaning people started talking about this cat. And that how he was from out of town, he wasn't from around here, he was from California. A lot of the population was afraid of a California gangster in Portland.
Right.
Where certain Portlanders started to want to try to imitate and emulate that.
And so what was the next step? Was it more guns started to appear? Like these guys started to appear, and they're like a pipeline opened up, like Tony Hobson said, guys coming up I-5.
That's right. The guys that we, would have to contact to try to get a piece, they were always these real elusive outsider type of individuals, and you had to have connections. And all of us, we just knew and assumed that anybody who was selling a gun had to be connected to or law enforcement. You know, I mean, it was just, you know, now mind you, our grandfathers, our uncles and great uncles, they all had stories of the 30-06 and, you know, they old hunting rifles. But, you know, when you saw what they were working with on the big screen, you wouldn't dare bring out granddad's rifle.
Like buckshot.
You had to have something, you know, automatic or semi-automatic, you know, and it's really interesting the connection to that and media, you know, and the screen. Like, you really see where, even in the documentary where Miss Williams is talking, you know, you hear her express how there was a certain coloring that was going on of the neighborhood where she was being told and she was being fed that she should be afraid, and you know, that her activism and her work should cause her to feel threatened and feel her daughter threatened. And once you know, turn that fear switch on, your behavior changes. And that's what took place with the new incoming wave of this new thing of California gangs and guns and whatnot. There was first this fear that was drummed up, and then you would meet a guy who had a story that came with it.
So when watching Northeast Passage, do you feel as though she was really under threat from your perspective? When you go back and you think about it, do you think she was under the threat that the way it was presented in the film?
I think that it's clear that, you know, after she got away and was able to kind of get around a more comfortable environment and she settles, I think she does, to me, I don't want to say admits that she may have been tricked, but I think that she kind of saw that, well, you know, it made sense that I should be afraid, but I can't say that I had any real incidents that justified that being afraid. So, you know, I'm sure any single black mother, not that she was single all the time, but, you know, any parent that has a child that sees any danger or anything in a neighborhood that we feel like their child should not see or be engaged in would naturally have a certain fear. Yeah. But I think that, you know, on her block and where she was at, you know, because of the nature of not wanting to have the police bother you or get in trouble, you know, we knew that was one of the areas that, well, you might not want to go around there because you got one of the, you know, we would call them a snitch or something.
Yeah, like she's a narc on the block.
Right.
So she had a reputation of being the narc on the block, right?
Yeah, and she wasn't the only one, you know. I mean, there were a few. And the interesting thing about those individuals, you know, they were who we considered, but when I say who, you know, what I would want to call the masses of the black community, you know, the so-called snitch was always someone who didn't really fit in, or who we didn't feel fit into the community. And a lot of that starts from the way you act and respond and move when you're afraid. You know, like, you know, you see the new people come into the neighborhood and the community today, and you'll be walking down the street sometimes, and they'll look down or look away. And, you know, a lot of times your instincts perceives that as, you know, what's wrong with them? Are they afraid of me, or what was wrong with me?
Well, what's wrong with me?
What did they see about me that they didn't like? And you go through this whole processing of what that is. Yeah. And that stands out to individuals. And we always had, you know, a few of us in our community that stood out like that to us. And you know, that natural immaturity of teasing the different one, or, you know, that's something that we grew up real heavy in school with. And I don't know how old we get before that leaves us. I mean, you know, look at us today.
But that's something that Nikki kind of cops to in the second film, where she says, you know, yeah, I had all this beef with, you know, not real beef, but I mean the conflict with people on the block, and they were cussing me out. But after they leave, she says, well, I guess that was kind of better, getting cussed out, because at least I could relate to him.
Right.
And now I'm just shut out. So in the first film, there's basically 3 houses that Nikki's complaining about through the first half of the film, and essentially we watch her work with the police and the neighborhood association to get those houses shut down. There's a police raid that's described in the film by Sergeant Jackson, Harry Jackson at the time, who's in the second film, and she perceived those as drug dealing houses, and that's the way the police also thought they. But you were saying that that's not true. That's not what they were. Could you tell us what that is? What's going on there?
You know, the dope house or the spot, or today the trap, that was a fairly well orchestrated environment. You didn't want police interaction.
What was the trap? What's the trap house?
This is the house. Really, this is the party spot. This is the place where the community. It's like a community house. You know, you see in these. I don't want to call them projects, but you see these apartment complexes, and they'll have in the center of the community, they'll have the general house or the community house, where the different activities of all those living in that complex come to share and enjoy that. That's what the spot always was. It wasn't just the place where business was conducted or where activities took place or where hustling took place. It was also where the cultural expression took place, where the rap battles took place. Mm-hmm. And we just happened to have, you know, the house that we were in was nearly a mansion. I mean, you know, I don't want to put the neighborhood on blast of where this place is at, but one of those corners on Albina and Shaver was just like, you know, it was a mansion. It was trapdoors. It was rooms everywhere, and then a big living room. So, you know, it was the place where we got down at, where everybody who was somebody and who was a part of the set or with us or engaged with us, that's where we would come. But these were controlled environments.
Right.
We didn't allow activity on the porch unless it's a Saturday and it's a sunny day. That's normal activity. We didn't allow. You couldn't use dope around the house, near the house, or anything like that. You know, but at nighttime it would get a little rowdy and a little noisy.
So drugs weren't sold there. That's not necessarily where the business was conducted.
You wouldn't. Yeah, you wouldn't.
You could use them there, but it wasn't where that was. Commerce was a different thing.
You had to leave the spot to conduct commerce.
Which is
you
interesting.
Go too far, but you had to get away from the.
It's interesting because they didn't in the film in Northeast Passage. The police say we busted the house, but we didn't really find any drugs. We found some pot.
Yeah.
And they were kind of perplexed by that.
Right.
So that's what you're saying is.
Yeah,
that's what's going on.
And I can't give up, you know, publicly too much of the
trade
game,
secrets.
But you know, it was you know, this was not a This was business, you know, and business is warfare, really. And so the only way you're going to be able to have any longevity is you got to control that environment. And a lot of those areas where you see police doing raids and busts, you know, these were houses who ultimately fell victim to drug use and would allow people to come over and do their dope there and share so that they could get with their habit, you know.
So the habit kicks in and takes over, and it descends from there.
Right, and you see the house deteriorate.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we're at the spot, you know. The thing of the sharing of wealth, the house or the spot, the trap, the zone, the turf, we paid one, you know, I don't want to use these, you know, degrading terms, but I don't know how else to talk about it other than to speak real, but we would pay chicken heads to cut the grass. We would pay someone
chicken heads,
to
come paint
or to fix,
yeah.
right, or to fix the roof. We got a leak in the house, or fix the plumbing. So you had to keep that under control. You couldn't let that get out of control.
And there were rules. There's always rules, even to the outsider who sees an area and says, "Oh, this is lawless." It's not true, and it's true of every neighborhood, every block through history.
Right.
There's always a rule.
There's
always someone in charge. But to that point, you said that this area was kind of like a little bit of a neglected zone, like it was a either disputed area or it was an unclaimed area. This one street that Nikki lived on was kind of an unregulated or less regulated zone, like somebody hadn't claimed it.
Right. It would be like, you know, the side street to a freeway.
Right. It's just,
you know, it's an area that's kind of in between the coming and goings, you know, or a dead zone, you know, or a neutral zone. We would call those zones neutral. You had to separate ourselves from the user.
right.
And so these would be like the user streets, the user zone, you know, the chicken head streets, the clucks, you know,
Right.
the areas that we didn't want to know no parts of that. You know, that's interesting. Another huge difference, it seems like back then, was that, man, none of us really would touch the stuff.
Right. Don't get high on your own spot.
Man, I mean, you know, that was a rule, and you would there was strong enforcement behind that, because you cannot consume the product that you manufacture and selling.
You were able to facilitate a lot of these things. How did the police, you know, what was the relationship between you and law enforcement? Because I've seen where someone gets with a girl who has a Section 8 voucher, and then boom, you can take her place over. But typically law enforcement at some point has to either turn a blind eye to it, or is something, you know, or something's done to break it down. So what was the relationship between law enforcement and people in Northeast Portland in this community?
There wasn't much of a relationship, but we didn't. Our relationship, if the police wanted to talk to someone about an alleged crime that took place or anything like that, they didn't come in the neighborhood and snatch people out, you know, because our mentality with the police, we grew up knowing that was, you know, the enemy. That they didn't mean us any good. We had too many examples. The officers, a lot of our uncles knew these people. They went to school with these guys, and then they became officers. And they were always, you know, there were black and white family feuds in Portland, Oregon that took place for generations.
When you say they knew them, you mean black people who became police officers or white people who became police officers?
Mostly white officers. Mm-hmm. There were always, like Mr. Jackson, you know, who was I won't say rare, but somewhat rare for us. You know, there were always, and once again, we're back kind of to the Nikki Williams of our community, like those who were a little different, or had a different vision for their life and what a black person should be. Some of those became police officers, but I tell you, not many in that day in Portland, because Portland just simply did not trust black police officers. Still does not appear to this day, but the relationship was more of an equal relationship. We were not afraid of the police because we knew who and what they were. And quite honestly, the influx of new weapons, it seemed to hit the gangs and the police at the same time.
So you mean in like automatic weapons?
In like automatic weapons, big weaponry, you know, like when you look at, there seemed, you know, someone in the, this is how it would go down. This is how the sale of the new weapon would go down. Somebody would have one, and they would demonstrate in many different ways on what it could do, and then that would cause
everybody
wanted one, but only a handful of those with the connections could get them.
And then the cops it was an arms race. The cops would get bigger guns.
That's right. And the interesting thing is that, you know, at this time too, you know, TV was starting to get good. Like, you know, there were stories that were popping up. The evening news started to get real. Like, you know, like I can remember in the early 90s when all of us started watching the news. Like you got brothers, you know, in the gang, in the set, that you wouldn't think, you know, but we started watching and studying the news. We started looking at, like,
why?
You know,
why were you watching the news?
Because we felt like we were part of it. We felt like, you know, and then at a certain point, you know, the certain stories that started popping up, you know, we wanted to be on the news. We wanted to be in the newspapers. We wanted to be seen because once we saw, oh, y'all know us now on the big screen. Well, let me, it
Right.
became this strange type of
fame.
Yeah, because you could. What started happening was the guys that came in, the outsiders, they came with these stories that nobody could verify, nobody could check on your
On the
your
internet.
creds, and
Yeah.
you couldn't Google, Lil Bone. Oh, Lil Bone got 9 murders. You hear these guys on these rap albums now. They talk about how much dope they sold. They talk about murders and this, and you be wondering, scratching your head, how can you rap about this now if that's what you were doing? So we didn't have no way to verify this. So I think people saw a lot of opportunity of making a name for themselves by being able to in some way get on that news.
And so is this just kids being kids and seeing that they're invincible, or was there really just no consequences for these actions, or was it that there were consequences but people didn't give a fuck?
Well, to be honest, it did. There wasn't as much. I want to say there was an image, kind of like your evening news today. Like, there's a lot of stories on the news that may make us think at times that crime is higher than what it really is, or something is taking place more than it actually really is. And I think in that time there was quite a bit of that going on, but nobody cared. The police didn't care about what was happening when the dope and the guns came in. I mean, it was almost like it didn't become the killing of one another until after you started getting strung out dope heads and families that were ravaged. Like addiction and what you would do for your addiction, that's what made us unlikable. That's what changed us from being human into being a monster, being a creation. And that developed a lot of self-hatred in our communities. Like, here we were youth and we were seeing people that were just strung out, and they would rob, Big Mama's house, Auntie's house, your uncle's house, your cousins would be robbing their own family members, and it made us not like that. And ultimately, that grew into a self-hatred, I mean.
So you guys really didn't know the poison you were dealing.
No, man, we didn't have no clue. How we saw it was like this. In the beginning was, man, I don't have a doctor. You may had, that's how we saw it. We saw it as like
all drugs are the same.
Self-medicating.
Yeah, all drugs are the same.
Man, I gotta, if I wake up, and I feel like crap, I need a little bit of this or a little bit of that. So we didn't see it like poison. We didn't see it with this big, stigma attached to it. And then a lot of us knew, I won't say a whole lot of us, but we all knew that the big money people was on the dope. Like, we knew. Heck, a lot of us in Portland, this is a pretty white area. The ones that were the most successful of us, and the big guys that had the connects, there was always somebody up in the West Hills that, and that's how a lot of guys was breaking connects and breaking rules.
So that's where things are at, as far as Northeast Passage goes. We introduced to Nikki Williams, narc on the block, and police at that time they don't care, or at least it seems like they don't care. And but Nikki's not the only narc. There's new narcs moving in, right? You say
Definitely.
Nikki is an outsider in your view within the community. She's from the community, but she's not. She's kind of a square peg in a round hole kind of thing.
Kind of good way to describe it.
Yeah, but then she's joined, and we see this in the film, by these new gentrifiers, these new white people, and they'll call the police at the drop of a hat, whether they know what's going on or not.
That's right.
And so, what was the impact of that?
So the impact of that, being in a city where, our law enforcement and our city ordinance kind of work like you have to have a homeowner or a citizen has to call.
Yeah.
And then that starts that process. And what started happening, I mean, the amount of calls just started to become absurd. I don't want to say, police don't have a job to do. But their interest didn't seem to be about what the petty calls. Like the police seemed to already know that the calls were kind of bogus, but they used it to kind of come in and see what was happening and to begin to engage. And to be honest, you know, they began to try to just see what was up, ask some questions, see who was who and what was what. And our interaction with the police were kind of like, you know, they were squares.
Yeah.
And so, you know, once again, we didn't have a whole lot of fear at all of the police, because we just figured that, you know, they were a little too corny to bother us.
Right.
It was just that straight up. That was just our mentality, you know. And it wasn't till you started seeing that mentality change, where police would gun you down, and then we know it was time to escalate the relationship. And then it caused a little wave where the police stopped, you know, answering the calls, so much so. But what was taking place was silently houses were being boarded up. And that's the thing. See, that process and whatnot, that was under the scenes. Like we could remember going to sleep for a couple hours, waking up, and the house down the block was boarded up.
Now, was it a previously vacant house, but you could get in?
No. These would be like kind of the dope houses, the auxiliary houses, you know, where people were starting to kind of gather. And then another thing too is that
to sell or to use.
Both, you know. I mean, everybody was. See, the thing is, this is what I was getting ready to go into, is that, you know, that late '70s going into the '80s, man, there wasn't a lot of jobs and a lot of money flowing at that time. I mean, people were going through it, you know, a lot like what we see coming down the pipeline now. And so wherever money was, you know, people wanted to have a piece of that. And so often in any endeavor that brings in dollars, we don't look at all of the supporting dollars or how that dollar begins to flow and circulate, because that's where you're going to see what's really going on. So there's not a whole lot of, you know, keep the money trail quiet type of a thing. But yeah, it produced a change, but there was still, the police still were not comfortable just coming in and kicking down doors and busting up. Like we really knew, we saw that when that happened, we saw that as, there go the police picking on the chicken heads again. That's how we saw that, you know, like we saw them targeting the weak,
right?
You know, and so, you know, we would tease them about that, you know. But then that began to change when we started seeing kind of new officers hit the streets, and they would gain reputations just like the so-called gangsters. You know, they would get reputation. That's like the
harder,
thing. It was
harder
like
cops.
Harder
cops.
Cops started coming from other cities that had interactions with other communities.
The birth of most gang task force is really just them saying, "Here's our gang to combat your gang."
So police pressure steps up. It's driven by complaints and new residents. Also, I'm assuming trap houses start closing down, and vacant houses, which I'm assuming were used for dealing and for using, start getting fixed up. People start moving into them. I mean, there's less place to go. Is that what started happening?
Yeah, that's a piece of it. You know, the interesting thing was, you know, there was these new set of laws that started to take place that, you know, could get your house boarded up just from suspicion, you know. And that's really what people were getting caught. Like now, the police could come and catch somebody on your property or find as small as an eighth of dope in your house and get your house condemned. Get your house put in foreclosure, drug evidence, drug house. Newspaper story comes out. The county took the house, city takes the house. They board it up for a little while. Once you get 2 or 3 houses boarded up on one block, you've dropped the value of everybody else's house. Then one buyer comes in, buys a house, fixes up that house on the corner, and then starts making phone calls to the city for everyone else to start to meet the standards of the new house on the block. Then the fines start getting levied against the house, more pressure on the household, and in a time where you don't have a whole lot of avenues to meet your rent, your mortgage or whatever your situation that you're in, you increase the activity that you're involved in to try to make that happen, and it's just a snowball. It was a perfect storm of the snatching of people's homes.
So what you're saying is like a lot of people who weren't really involved in the life or who were, you know, guilty of infractions in a community where there was much worse going on, got their homes taken away unfairly.
That's right.
Or lumped in. Like,
there was this labeling beginning to take place. You know, this block is unsafe. This neighborhood is high crime. This, you know, developers sat back and said, "Ooh, look at this." I mean, today, even in real estate, any of us who are trying to enter into our first home buying or any home buying situation, you're looking for the deal. I mean, you would
Sure.
it would be a blessing for you to find a foreclosed home that you could just get up on the back taxes and get it at a decent price. And people who had a little bit of change, they saw this as a huge opportunity.
So when it comes to like your relationship with some of the gentrifiers, I noticed in your last statement it was a little bit of empathy, because you see that they're just trying to take advantage of the American dream. They want to get a home and they're able to get it cheap. How does that empathy kind of go in with how you personally feel toward individuals that are coming in and gentrifying?
Man, that's the crux. That's a great question right there. You know, I can talk about the deal and who wouldn't want to have that opportunity now that I'm older and I have a family and a wife, and you naturally want to we all need food, clothing, and shelter. So I can speak from that standpoint now of, hey, from the so-called gentrifier side of things, yeah, I could easily see that. And many whites today and just had no knowledge of, you know, the black history, so to speak, with the exception of what comes out bubblegum over the popular airways. But, you know, talks like this where people can really get an understanding that no, you had a federal government that trickled down through states, through cities, through counties, the policies of white domination.
So there's like a certain level of bitterness that I had to overcome, like when I watched parts of my community get gentrified. There's a pub and a marijuana shop like next to each other, and it's culturally acceptable and it's legal now to just to do all the things that was criminalized and demonized when it was a part of just, our youth, us growing up and us wanting to express ourselves in that way. So it took a while for me to kind of get beyond that. And I still, when I ride past like the amount of dispensaries and everything, I still just think about how many people in my family did time, or people in my neighborhood who did time behind this, and now it's okay because it's what's wanted.
But yeah, I don't really know. I haven't got over my frustration behind the hypocrisy behind that. I haven't got over how you could legalize marijuana, for example, in a state and not just instantly let everyone out who was ever charged and have that completely removed. I mean, anything that says anything about marijuana should automatically be removed from everyone that's in, out, that's had that on their record or any of that. But then that poses a whole array of problems that society is going to be. This is still all new, and we're all going to, see how all of this kind of pans out. But it's very frustrating to see that come down the pipe now, and to have to really I mean, heck, the first major trouble I got into was behind some marijuana, and to just have that now, and the whole culture of drinking 40. See, to me, brother, this is about an image of certain people in society that society has been made to fear. And two brothers walking down the street with beers in their hands has been made scarier than two white men walking down the street with beers in their hands.
Do you see the same thing happen in what is now the quote-unquote opioid crisis,
I do.
epidemic, now that it's out in the white world? Now drugs are a problem, and we must be compassionate and feel for these drug-addicted people. When before, growing up in the 80s, is like, oh, you're on drugs? In jail.
That's right.
Like, oh, you died? You overdosed? You got what you deserved. People get hammered on they get the book thrown at them, whether they were involved in drug dealing or peripherally involved or not involved at all. People start going to jail, and mass incarceration starts happening. And now, one of the things that people would say during the filming of the last film, Priced Out, is that people used to settle scores on site in the neighborhood, and they were all in the neighborhood. And now they do it. It happens less because they don't see each other as much, because everybody's scattered out on the west side and Vancouver, out in the numbers. Is that what you see? Is like people just don't run into each other as much, and so things are kind of quieted down.
Yeah, we're not concentrated into one area. At a particular time, 80% of the whole black population in the state of Oregon lived in North and Northeast Portland. Which, when you look at the big picture numbers, we've always been a small, 8-11% in this area. But when it's concentrated, that was a black community. Now, with everything being spread out and dispersed, you do seem to see these things taking place, but there is still a control of where these things take place. I mean, that's extremely controlled, in my opinion, far more controlled now than it ever was in the past. And there's little pockets of activity that takes place, but there's also, it produces this lack of community. It produces this, I don't know you, you don't know me, divide and conquer type of mentality, where the brothers and sisters who are in East County, may be looked at different than the brothers and sisters who are in the Central City area, or the artistic expression brothers and sisters with the blue collar. Like there's this mentality that begins to develop, and then these narratives that are created that enforce that we can't unify, that we can't come together. And I just want to say this right now. I want to give a big shout out to Black Portland in this time right now, because there are amazing things taking place in this city, and there always has been, but those stories aren't being told. And so I just want to say to all of you all, Black Portlanders, whether you were born and raised here or just moved here and are trying to affect some change, the things that are taking place in this city, man, are not taking place in a lot of cities across the country. And I think the more the national light is shown on this type of work, this grassroots work that's really taking place, and the new communities that are emerging out of this need for community, man, a big shout out to all of Black Portland and all of you all who are doing that work, because that nobody's talking about that. You only hear, we can't get along, we can't do this and do that, and you hear blame and the mention of some of the elders and all this, and quite honestly, it's gonna take all of us. And so I just love what I see happening right now, and that's not highlighted enough. It's on in Portland, Oregon. Like there's a lot, and we say the black community, but I tell you, the black community is becoming a mentality. It's becoming a return to the aboriginal living and the original living of how man and woman lived long before we were, discussing these mediums of exchange. And so I see and feel that growing, and it's a struggle because a lot of us are stuck in our old ways of disunity. But if you're willing to rethink everything and make yourself new again, like, our unity is right at our fingertips on a lot of different levels. And we have an opportunity right now in Portland to socially to become a national model for something that, has been very difficult to try to establish, and that is a society that can grow and that can thrive, being independent, producing its own needs, and then sharing those needs with other communities to grow into who we are ultimately becoming, regardless of what the stories that's being told.
That's well said.
And then how did you? And we talked earlier before we started recording that you didn't do any time, you didn't have any convictions, significant convictions. How did you leave the life?
How do you sustain being the hardest in the neighborhood, which starts off as being, you know, the best fist fighter or the best at something? It wasn't just fighting, it being the best at something. You know, as you grow up, you have priorities. You have to start paying, you know, you have to have a place to live or you're going to be homeless. You have to, you know, you're going to get some children if you're natural. And then you start providing for that. So life is what happens, but I never see it or saw it as getting out. I really see it as an understanding of what that's all about now, and needing to make that into the unity that produces a nation, that produces a vibrant society, a community of people all advocating towards the necessities of life: food, clothing, and shelter.
Was there an incident though, were you just like a moment where you're like, I gotta stop, I gotta get just a regular job, I gotta
the absolute moment, point in time was October 16th on a Monday, 1995. That was the day of the Million Man March. And
it resonated really powerfully inside you.
And so there was always that banging around in your head, like, when I grow up, I'm gonna get right and be this. And it wasn't about religion. It wasn't about being Muslim. It wasn't about any of that. It was about, these are the things that we have to do in order to be a community. It's real basic. But when I saw all of those men and women, but just that sea, and man, listening to them speakers, man, leading up to Minister Farrakhan, you know, seeing the young brother Baptiste up there, and I mean, we had never seen nothing like that before. That was a complete, that was a mind blower. And I was in Las Vegas sitting up watching that, and it was at that moment that I knew I'm done with it. That I had renewed understanding and hope that whatever Farrakhan had and whatever that was about, that was what I saw that could turn the thing all the way over and bring that unity. Like we had never seen. We used to see pictures of the march in '63 with King and different demonstrations, and that was always like, man, look at that, look at us coming together for a particular thing. But the Million Man March thing, and that call wasn't about asking nobody to do nothing for us. That call was, go back to your neighborhoods, go back to your communities, and make the place where you live a safe place for your families. And that just was like, you know, that was it for me. And so shortly after that, I came back to Portland to get right.
So looking back now, do you think that what Nikki Williams was doing, being the narc on the block, was that the right decision?
Or I would say it was a decision probably with not all the information made. I don't want to just say she was wrong. What I want to say is that it's a perfect demonstration of a breakdown in a community that does not make an effort to hear and understand all parts, all sides, and all segments of its own self. And I think that we got caught up in listening to other than self to tell us about self.
All right, well, that's what we're dedicated here to do, is at least cover as many sides of this issue as we can.
Man, I appreciate it, man. It's an honor.
Rahsaan Muhamaad, thank you very much for coming to talk to us.
Thank you.
All right, so that was Rahsaan, and there's a lot to think about there.
Yeah, it is. You know, what's funny is, you know, he gave us a lot of material to go through, and we really did our best to leave it raw. to just, leave it out there and allow everyone to kind of just soak in his story and allow his story to be authentic, without, us altering it or anything. And I can appreciate everyone's individual story. It does make me come back to the point we made at the beginning of the show, is that we're interested in this series and hearing your story and hearing your perspective on it. As far as whether you agree or disagree or not, we really do want to know.
But yeah, we wanted to hear from a perspective we haven't heard from before, either in the films or on these podcasts. And, Rahsaan is also in the Nation of Islam.
Yes.
Which is another perspective you just don't hear in Portland.
You really don't. And I was surprised to hear that here. Like, in the Midwest, there was a large population that in both cities I lived in, I saw a presence. I did not expect to see or hear of a presence here. And so that is unique.
Yeah, growing up back east, they're Nation guys, and they're very consistent.
Yeah.
They have a very consistent sort of way of speaking, and their beliefs are very consistent.
Yeah.
And you never run into those guys out here.
Well, we're out of here this week.
All right, sir. Thank you.
So we'll be back in a few weeks, and what's the different ways they can get the podcast? iTunes.
Once again, you can hear us on iTunes, YouTube. You can subscribe, please, to both. Follow us on Facebook. You can just look us up as Priced Out or Portland Gentrification Documentary. We're on Instagram and Twitter, and pricedoutmovie.com.
All right, see you next time.
See you next time.